Welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University. School of Education, SOE. Master of Arts, Education, MA, EDU. Specialized areas in education. Adult education. MAE01 Understanding Adult Education. Block-1 Development of Adult Education. Unit-1 Adult Education, the basic concept, terms, features and objectives.
1.0 Introduction. Right now you are beginning your academic journey through your program. You are in Unit 1 of Block 1 of course MAE01 of the program. When you had decided to choose this program, Pagdai, you must have had your own concept or meaning of adult and adult education. Your concept of adult could be right or wrong or partially correct, and you will so appreciate it after you understood these concepts clearly in this unit. To begin with, we all know that, as human beings, we go through 4 important education stages in life: childhood, teenage, adulthood and old age. We further know for certain that the teenage stage is between 13 and 19, while adulthood, in general, is the longest, most productive and significant stage falling in between teenage and old age. Thus, adults constitute a large chunk of most of the societies and perform diverse and dynamic roles in various spheres of their life. Historically, it is they who have contributed to the growth, transformation and transmission of civilization over the ages. It is all the result of their adult education, and hence adult education is as old as human civilization itself. Therefore, in simple terms, the entire education received by and spread over the adulthood of any individual is nothing but adult education. We are all adults with different levels of maturity, biologically, socially, economically, politically, culturally, morally, and so on. As adults, our place, role and contribution remains significant and dynamic in every sphere of life. Adult education, as an essential and integral part of overall education of an individual, is dynamic and begins with the onset of adulthood and is coextensive with the adult life of an individual. Thus, its forms, relevance, meaning, nature, objectives, functions, approaches, curriculum, duration, coverage, etc. keep on changing from time to time in a given society or country. The changing socio-cultural, geographic, economic, political, cultural, moral and other conditions determine its overall place and organization in a society. It is also important for you to know that although adult education, as an academic subject and as a field of specialization of the discipline of education, has emerged only recently, it has now established itself as a discipline and a profession in its own capacity. You will realize all this by the time you complete your journey through this program. In this unit, we will discuss in detail about adult education, its features, goals and objectives, relevant terms used in adult education and other related matters. 1.1 Objectives. After going through this unit, it is expected that you will be able to understand the concepts of adult and adult education, explain the meaning of different but relevant terms used in adult education, distinguish between and among different terms used in literacy and adult education, describe the need, significance and characteristic features of adult education, and state the goals and objectives of adult education. 1.2 Concept of adult education. You can understand the concept adult education better if you first understand the concept adult very clearly. We will therefore focus first on adult. In simple terms, we can define adult as a person who has attained physical, mental, emotional and social maturity or legal age for marriage, or for franchise or voting right. But can we say for certain that every person who has attained physical maturity only, or legal age of adulthood can be considered to be mature adult of that society or country? Or can we say at what age a person will definitely become an adult, in terms of maturity? The answer is no. But at the same time, as mentioned above, we can be sure of one thing, that we are all adults with different levels of maturity and belong to the most significant and productive age group. Physically, socially, mentally, economically, politically, morally, culturally, and so on. Nevertheless, we need to remember that maturity is an endless process. And in general it increases with one's age, experience and knowledge. In the context of adult education, the concept adult remained inadequately defined because of the multiplicity of criteria used in defining it. The Oxford Advanced Learner's Dictionary, 1995, defines adult as 1. A. Grown to full size or strength. B. Intellectually and emotionally mature. 2. Legally old enough to vote, marry, etc. Various other definitions given by different adult educationists. Wiltshire, 1966, Cameron, 1969, Apps, 1979, Shingi, 1980, Knowles, 1980, Reggae, 1982, Jarvis, 1990, have also taken into account different criteria, often two or more, like age, legal or otherwise, experience and/or maturity, physical/biological, social, psychological, etc., citizenship with full rights and duties, and so on. Also, the legal age of adulthood for franchise, marriage, etc. of males and females varies from country to country. For instance, the legal age of adulthood in the United Kingdom is 18 years. In India, the legal age for franchise, voting right, is 18 years, while the legal age for marriage of males is 21 years and for females it is 18 years. All these definitions reveal that it is very difficult to define the concept adult, theoretically, or draw practical boundaries, and thereby render it to remain ideal rather than practicable. Notwithstanding the fact that no one definition defines adult adequately or exhaustively, some have classified adulthood into stages and defined each stage separately. Erickson, 1963, Sheehy, 1976. This is mainly because of the fact that the transition from childhood to adulthood is gradual, not sudden, and the rate of transition varies throughout life from individual to individual and from environment to environment. Therefore, drawing clear demarcating lines between childhood, when it ends, and adulthood, when it starts and ends, by any one criterion or all criteria together, is a very difficult task. Thus, adulthood by itself is not definitive because of its continuous transition throughout life. In this context, we need to consider the question whether it is essential to have such distinction between child and adult as raised by Age, 1982, p.3. It is also important for us to recall some actions of a few children, wherein they reflect maturity of an adult, and some actions of some adults which reflect immaturity of a child. You can thus see child-man or man-child in terms of their maturity. But, Cybercoitus in Temptus, May 9, 2007, see http://ask.metafilter.com/ draws one clear distinction between adults and juveniles. I think real adults take responsibility for and clean up their own messes, emotional, domestic, culinary, environmental, whatever, unless physically or mentally incapacitated. Juveniles, whatever their physical ages, make someone else clean up after them. Characteristics of an adult. At this juncture, we need to have a clear understanding of the diverse and comprehensive traits or characteristics by which a person can be called an adult. An adult, therefore, is a person who 1. Is of certain age, legal or otherwise, 2. Is mature, physically, mentally, emotionally, intellectually and morally. 3. Is sensible and has the ability to act rationally and responsibly by understanding his/her own rights and limitations and of others. 4. Can exercise self-control or restrain oneself. Education. 5. Can focus with partial or full personal sacrifice on public cause of great importance. 6. Can make balanced choices in picking and choosing actions involving not only gains and pleasures, but also loss, danger and pains. 7. Owns up responsibility for his/her own actions. 8. Can get to be a kid, youth, adult or the old as and when required and continue to exist as adult. 9. Identifies one's own strengths and weaknesses. And 10. Acts and reacts with kindness, compassion and reason and with long-term perspective legal towards self-actualization. Reflection. With your understanding of the concept of adult and based on your observations of the members of your community, can you identify the persons who are adults by A. Physical maturity, B. Mental maturity, C. Legal age for marriage, and D. Legal age for franchise? Compare the characteristics of each of the above identified persons with the characteristics of an adult mentioned above and arrive at the conclusion as to who is really adult is. How to become an adult. Here comes the role of education, adult education. Remember that becoming an adult is not a one-time affair, and it is a lifelong process as it comes mostly from age, observation and experience over the lifetime of an individual. This in a nutshell is the crux of adult education. You will now agree that adult education has always been there in every society and country, maybe in different forms. Thus, adult education is not of recent origin, but has gained currency in recent times because of its growing need, significance, organized presence, acceptability and popularity. Every man and woman feels familiar with their own concept of adult education, but when asked to define it, a majority of them feel real difficulty. Don't you also feel so? Perhaps, yes. So, what then is adult education? Misconception about adult education. In the developing countries where illiteracy is a major problem, the meaning of the term adult education is widely misconceived only as adult literacy, i.e., something to do with imparting of only literacy to adults. Thus, it is not surprising that, in practice too, adult education is more often referred to as adult literacy in developing countries. Literacy generally refers to reading, writing and arithmetic skills of a person with understanding in the language as he normally speaks or uses. In fact, adult education is literacy plus many other things. It includes the development of functionality and awareness in relation to various different aspects of life. Another misconception is whether adult education comes under formal education system, school, college, university, etc., or under non-formal education system, that is outside the formal education system, or under both. Surely, the scope of adult education is very wide and includes both the systems and more. Its activities range from leisure time spent in reading to attending classes as remedial learning, from learning literacy to achieving or acquiring a formal certificate, a diploma or a university degree, from learning on the job to freelance learning, etc. So, different people in different countries have called adult education by different names such as liberal education, basic education, remedial education, vocational education, avocational education, literacy education, continuing education, lifelong education, and so on. But, the term adult education has, in fact, become a generic or more common term to mean and include a wide range of things for adults. Nevertheless, adult education has currently came into wide use throughout the world, yet, the concept is among the most problematic ones in the field. Therefore, Sharan and Phyllis, 1989, p. 15, are right when they say it is rare to come upon a single sentence that will do justice to the full range of this phenomenon of adult education, or that will satisfy the many different kinds of practitioners who call themselves adult educators. This is so because all these practitioners feel that this need not be considered a problem at all. Although different countries use different terms, adult education has been recognized as an acceptable term for many. As mentioned above, the term adult education has been used to refer to different things in different countries. For instance, it is used to refer to liberal education for adults in the United Kingdom, whereas in the United States it has the wider connotation of education of adults, whether it be vocational or otherwise. In India, the populace has widely misconceived it as literacy education for adults, old people, because of the magnitude of illiteracy. The government's literacy drives are also concentrated more on eradication of illiteracy. Government of India has also called it by different names at different times: community education, adult literacy, adult education, workers' education, etc. As early as 1952, UNESCO had stated in its International Directory of Adult Education that, in essence, adult education is so closely related to the social, political, economic, geographic and cultural conditions of each country that no uniform or precise definition can be arrived at. As Agrawal, 1989, p.1, rightly points out, adult education cannot be explained or understood in a vacuum. It has to be seen in the cultural context and in the nature of the activity. Added to this, the concept is expressed through different terms: adult education, education of adults, and education for adults. One may wonder whether they mean one and the same or are they different. 1.2.1 Adult education. Adult education has been variously defined by different people and institutions. It is more useful for us to have a look at a few definitions quoted and analyzed by Lakshmi Reddy, 2000, pp.428, from different viewpoints. According to him, some have defined it as education that starts at a particular stage or level of education. According to Lindemann, 1961, adult education, more accurately defined, begins where vocational education leaves off. Adult education offers some, who were not privileged, a last chance to learn. Some feel a need for training in basic skills of learning, so they enroll for learning, reading, writing and arithmetic. If we examine this definition, we will find the following essential elements that characterize it. 1. It is post-vocational education. 2. It is education for the deprived classes. 3. It is training in basic skills of learning, i.e., literacy. Some others have defined adult education by looking at it as a process. The Education Exeter Conference 1969 defines it as the process whereby persons who no longer, or did not, attend school on a regular and full-time basis, unless full-time programs are especially designed for adults, undertake sequential and organized activities within a conscious intention of bringing about changes in information, knowledge, understanding or skills, appreciation and attitudes, or for the purpose of identifying and solving personal or community problems. Liveright and Haygood, 1969, p.8. In this definition, we can observe that there are two elements that characterize it, viz. 1. Part-time or full-time process. 2. Sequential and organized activities. On the contrary, there are other definitions which do not link adult education with any level and treat it as an activity or a program or a process that encompasses so many things. According to Paulo Freire, 1970, adult education is a cultural action for freedom. It means, it is a liberating force for adults. Friedman, 1972, quoted in Jarvis, 1990, considers adult education as a process which is part of cultural development, primarily the establishment of a means of communication between the cultural systems of transmitters, inventors, research workers, creative minds, and the cultural system of the receivers, i.e., Groups for whom adult education is intended. We will find that there are two important elements in this definition. 1. A process which is part of cultural development. 2. Communication between transmitters and receivers. According to Fourier-1, 1972, the normal culmination of the education process is adult education. There is one characteristic element in this definition, i.e., terminal education for adults. But, in view of the Education Committee of the OECD, 197.1, adult education refers to any learning activity or program deliberately designed for adults. Its ambit is taken as spanning non-vocational, vocational, general, non-formal, and community education, and it is not restricted to any particular level. As we can see, this definition includes three essential elements. 1. All activities and programs for adults. 2. General, non-formal, vocational and non-vocational education. 3. Not restricted to any particular level. The General Conference of UNESCO, 1976, comprehensively defines adult education as the entire body of organized educational processes, whatever content, level and method, whether formal or otherwise, whether they prolong or replace initial education in schools, colleges and universities, as well as in apprenticeship, whereby persons regarded as adults by the society to which they belong develop their abilities, enrich their knowledge, improve their attitudes or behavior in the twofold perspective of full personal development and participation in balanced and independent social, economic and cultural development. We can very clearly notice the following essential elements in this definition. 1. It includes all organized educational processes. 2. It encompasses all content, levels and methods. 3. It includes formal or non-formal education for adults. 4. It prolongs or replaces initial education in schools, colleges and universities, and objectives. 5. It develops abilities, knowledge, attitudes and behaviors. And 6. It develops adults in twofold manner, full personal development and participation in development process. Adult education is also regarded as the provision of largely non-vocational education for people who have left school and are not formally registered for a college and university course leading to certification. Daytime or evening tuition may be provided by an extramural or extension department or a college or a university, or by other institutions such as trade unions or the Workers' Educational Association. It may take place in college or secondary school premises and may cover a wide range of cultural, recreational, community and sporting activities. Some writers have defined adult education by viewing it as a self or others-directed efforts aimed at finding solutions to certain problems. Self-directed in the sense that it is a voluntary, serious and frequently organized effort of adult individuals and groups to find, through educational means, information, attitudes, understanding and skills helpful in diagnosing and solving their vocational, personal, familial and civic problems. According to Sharma, 1984, pp. 15-16, adult education takes into itself both self-education, whereby a learner is responsible for management of his learning activities, and others-directed education, whereby a teacher, leader, media, or some other educational agent is primarily responsible for the management of learning. While recognizing this enlarged application of the term adult education, most writers limit their investigation to those activities of men and women who are guided and shaped for a definite period of time by the desire to learn. This definition is characterized by three essential elements. 1. Self-directed or others-directed. 2. Guided by desire to learn and shaped to teach. 3. Problem-solving. Kundu, 1986, p.16, states that adult education is a development-oriented education which can be planned and designed by others as well as the learners themselves. The adult learner, to a great extent, can assert in regard to content, methodology, place and time of learning. The three characteristic elements that we can notice in this definition are: 1. Organized by adults themselves or by others. 2. Learner-centered. 3. Development-oriented.
In era, the Murphy Committee defined adult education as the provision and utilization of facilities whereby those who are no longer participants in the full-time school system may learn whatever they need to learn at any period of their lives. Adult education, thus, is the organized provision of learning situations to mature men and women with the purpose of enabling them to enlarge and to interpret their own living experience for solving their own and the community problems. De Caste, et al. 1989. In this definition, one can observe two approaches. 1. Cafeteria education, a choice-based provision and utilization of learning education situations. 2. Learning throughout life of mature people for solving their own and community problems. Thus, some of these definitions of adult education restrict it to mere provision of educational facilities out of which the learners pick and choose according to their needs, interests, etc., making for a cafeteria approach to education. If we go on to quote and analyze, we have many definitions offered by other adult educationists. Hence, for the present we accept the widely accepted definition offered by UNESCO, which was the result of some collective international thinking of the adult educationists. What then is education of adults? 1.2.2 Education of adults. Like many academics, you too might have got a doubt as to whether there is any difference between adult education and education of adults. It is, of course, interesting too to know whether there does exist any difference in the usage of these two terms. Can these be used interchangeably, or are they different? Perhaps it is not even out of context to look at different views expressed in this regard. According to Jarvis, 1990a, pp. 29-32, the term education of adults tends to be used to refer to all education of adults. In other words, its meaning relates to the conceptual understanding of both education and adult. The term adult education carries specific connotations in the United Kingdom, which imply that it is liberal education, and carries a stereotype of being middle class, leisure time pursuit. It must be recognized that the term adult education has a social definition as being a form of liberal education undertaken by those people who are regarded as adults. Therefore, it is more a social rather than a conceptual definition, and that is why it is important to distinguish between adult education and the education of adults. In this view, education of adults is wider than adult education. However, the definition of adult still complicates this discussion. Nevertheless, he ends up saying that what is called education of adults in the United Kingdom is synonymous to adult education in the United States. What then is education for adults? 1.23 Education for adults. According to De Leon, 1970, adult education includes all kinds of education for adults, in schools and out of school, formal and informal, full-time and part-time, for persons who no longer attend schools as well as for those who never attended a school, and so on. We can see through this definition that it is more precise, comprehensive and all-embracing. Ansari, 1996, p.56, views adult education as education for adults outside the formal system not leading to qualification, education for adults outside the formal system leading to qualification, and deliberate provision of education for adults within the formal system. According to Lakshmi Reddy, 2000, pp. 7-8, adult education is part-time or full-time education for men and women of all ages, either organized by themselves or provided by schools, learning centers, or other agencies which enable them to improve their general or professional knowledge, skills and abilities by either continuing their education or resuming their initial or incomplete education of previous years. Adult education is, thus, usually more flexible in its structure than traditional, mandatory education. Adult education may offer credits towards higher education degrees or do not offer any degrees or credits. Its clientele include all those adults who have never been to school, who have dropped out of school or who are continuing their education in formal, non-formal and objectives vocational educational institutions of different kinds or who are seeking employment or who are engaged in different occupations or professions. As Lakshmi Reddy, 2000, pp. 28-29, further puts it, though UNESCO's 1976 definition of adult education is widely accepted, the concept adult education 7, like the concept adult, has yet to have a universally accepted definition. The different definitions of adult education, Lindemann, 196-1, Liveright and Haygood, 1969, De Leon, 1970, Nairaya, 197-1, OECD, 197-1, UNESCO, 1970a, include adults who are illiterates and literates, irrespective of their occupation, socio-economic background, etc., and 2. Undertaking educational activities in non-vocational, vocational, general, formal, non-formal and informal education system on full-time or part-time basis organized by adults for themselves or by others for adults. These definitions embrace education leading or not leading to degrees, certificates, etc., covering a wide range of subjects and activities. Most of these definitions are concerned with promotion of knowledge, skills, attitudes, capacities, etc. for the development and or welfare of individuals, society and or nation. However, there is no unanimity on definition of adult education either from the viewpoint of class of its clientele target groups, nature, aims, objectives, form, type, subjects, scope, stages or levels. Having looked at different views on definitions of adult education 7 and education of adults 7, we understand that though they are generic terms, they are used in different countries to include a wide variety of activities, experiences, efforts, approaches, processes and programs for adults, which cover different spheres of lives of different groups or cultural systems. They, therefore, reflect the differences in the historical, political, social and cultural conditions of different countries. But, we need to be very clear that whichever of these three terms, adult education, education of adults and education for adults, is used by anyone, in general it includes all kinds and forms of education for adults, i.e., for their growth, development, welfare and transformation. So, we should not have any confusion about these terms or about the distinction between and among these terms as they are used interchangeably by different people in different countries, either inadvertently or intentionally to mean one and the same. In this course material also hereafter use of any one of these three terms wherever used, means one and the same, unless it is specifically mentioned otherwise. 1.3 Relevant terms explained. In this section we will focus our discussion on some terms and concepts related to adult education. This would help you in dispelling misunderstanding or any confusion you have about them. However, our discussion does not go into the details of the origin and growth of these terms and concepts, as it is mainly meant to familiarize you with these terms and concepts and the difference, if any, between them. 1.3.1 Fundamental education. It is the responsibility of the parents, society and the state to see that all human beings in a modern society acquire or achieve a certain minimum level of education. This is generally called elementary education and offered to the individuals during their childhood starting with their formal schooling. In reality, due to some reason or the other, many individuals either get deprived of the opportunity to have access to formal school or after access to it they may fail to acquire the desired level of elementary education. In such a case, It is more the state's responsibility to provide them with remedial opportunities/measures in their later years or adult life to promote in them this elementary education as remedial education. Such education is called, by UNESCO, fundamental education. Fundamental education is preparation of children or adults who have not had an opportunity for traditional formal schooling, for effective participation in community life through instructions in basic facts and skills as of literacy, agriculture, dwelling, health and hygiene and citizenship and so on. 1.3.2 Formal, non-formal and informal education. Hartnett, 1972, p.14, and Coombs 8A1, 1973, p.10, define formal education as the hierarchically structured, chronologically graded education system running from primary school through the university and including, in addition to general academic studies, a variety of specialized programs and institutions for full-time professional education and training. Non-formal education, as the name itself indicates, is education without formalities or with relaxed formalities. It refers to education which reduces or 16 relaxes formalities and rigidities with the purpose of avoiding hindrances in making education more accessible to different kinds and types of learners. In other words, non-formal education, as implied by the term, is supposed to be available outside the formal or conventional system with enhanced access to many learners, while Hartnett, Op. Cit. calls it non-traditional education and defines it as a set of learning experiences free of time and space limitations. Coombs 8A1, Op. Cit. call it non-formal education and define it as any organized educational activity outside the established formal system, whether operating separately or as an important feature of some broader activity that is intended to serve identifiable learning clientele and learning objectives. To clarify this definition further, the same authors distinguished non-formal education from informal education. They define ergomal education as the truly lifelong process, whereby every individual acquires attitudes, values, skills and knowledge from daily experience and the educative influences and resources in his or her environment, from family and neighbors, from work and play, from the market place, the library, and the mass media. However, Radcliffe and Coletta, 1989, p.60, state that in practice no hard lines of demarcation exist between formal, non-formal and informal education, while many activities may be perceived as falling exclusively into one category alone, many share aspects of two or all of them. Non-formal education, like formal education, can also be organized at any level, ranging from primary education in schools to higher education in universities or institutions of higher learning. It can be offered by existing formal institutions, by relaxing the formalities or by establishing specialized structures or institutions outside these institutions. You are, perhaps, aware of institutes of correspondence courses, directorates of distance education in conventional universities, and open school, state open universities, state resource centers for adult education, and so on outside the formal system. All these are examples, and part, of non-formal education system in India. Of course, the Open University is the more current term coined to refer to an institution providing higher education in more open, flexible or non-formal manner through the distance mode. 1.3.3 Schooling. Population growth on one hand and lack of commensurate expansion of school system with its rigidities on the other, amongst many other things, have deprived many people of their access to education. It is in this context some educational thinkers have focused their thinking on taking education out of the physical environs of the school. Ivan Illich, 1971, Deschooling Society, was the main exponent of such school of thought called Deschooling 7. Deschooling is the philosophy that underlines non-formal or open education. In simple terms, it means bringing education out of the confines of school. In other words, it espouses free education shorn of all rigidities of formal systems such as one-point entry or single-point admission, regular attendance, definite and common syllabus, rigid timings, periods of teaching and learning, examinations and so on. It prescribes relevant, flexible, systematic and diversified education for the learners with diverse needs and interests. You may have a doubt here. What is the difference between non-formal education, open education and deschooling? In fact, these terms are synonymous and espouse the same philosophy. Open learning for education emphasizes openness of learning for educational opportunities. Non-formal education emphasizes freeing of education from all the formalities, rigidities, while deschooling 7 emphasizes on bringing education outside the physical environs of the schools, which in broad education sense includes all the educational institutions. 1.3.4 Lifelong education. In its broadest sense, lifelong education includes all processes by which an individual acquires formal, non-formal and informal education continually or continuously throughout adulthood, for necessary career development and valuable personal enrichment. It is far from being limited to the period of attendance at a school for education and learning. It extends throughout life, includes all skills and branches of knowledge, uses all possible means and gives the opportunity to all people for full development of their personality. Lifelong education is the provision and utilization of educational experiences throughout a person's life. It implies learning throughout life and, therefore, denotes an overall scheme aimed both at restructuring the existing education system and at developing the entire educational potential inside and outside the education system. Its rationale is in part the same as that for adult education, except that it intrinsically involves a radical reform of organization, form and content of all other phases of education, and also implies a greater recognition of the educational functions of non-educational agencies. The UNESCO report Learning to Be, 4A et al., 1972, is the leading policy document on lifelong education. It contains a coherent philosophy developed about man, education and society to which the idea of lifelong learning was related. It adopts as optimistic view of education to change society. Eagerness to learn. Libido science is deeply rooted in human nature, and once external obstacles are removed, it will provide the necessary motivation for lifelong learning. The society of the future will be a learning society. The culture of future society will be scientific humanism. Every individual must be in a position to keep learning throughout life. The idea of lifelong education is the keystone of the learning society. Lifelong education will be the master concept for educational policies in the years to come for both developed and developing countries. Lifelong education in the fullest sense of the term means that business, industrial and agricultural firms will have extensive educational functions. There appear to be two approaches to lifelong education in contemporary literature. One that stretches initial education to what is termed further education, and the other that stretches the concept even forward throughout life using the concept of continuing education. It thus stretches from initial education to further education to continuing education. It is a process that begins in childhood and continues throughout life. It includes formal, informal and non-formal education received by the individual. The educational and learning processes in which children, young people and adults of all ages are involved in the course of their lives, in whatever form, should be considered as a whole constituting into lifelong education. UNESCO. 1976. Lifelong education is the concept that education is not a once-for-all experience confined to the initial cycle of full-time education commenced in childhood, but a process that must continue throughout life. Life itself is a continuous learning process, but each person also needs specific opportunities for further and new education, both vocational and general, throughout life. In order that an individual may adapt to change in his own circumstances, marriage, parenthood, professional situation, old age, etc., may achieve his fullest potential for individual development and may keep abreast of technical and social change. Lifelong education comprehends both individuals' intentional and incidental learning experiences. Dave, 1976, p.34, regards lifelong education as a process of accomplishing personal, social and professional development throughout the lifespan of individuals in order to enhance the quality of life of both individuals and their collectives. It includes formal, non-formal and informal patterns of learning throughout the life cycle of an individual for the concise and continuous enhancement of the quality of life of his own and that of his society. According to Jarvis, 1990, p.35, lifelong education is any planned series of incidents having a humanistic basis directed towards the participants' learning and understanding that may occur at any stage in the lifespan. Reviewing certain approaches and underlying philosophies, he expresses that lifelong education is a concept and an idea which remains rather meaningless unless it is actually implemented. Report to UNESCO of the International Commission on Education for the 21st Century, The Laws, 1996, reiterates the role of education in personal and social development, particularly in the context of globalization. It proposes learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together, and learning to be as the four pillars, the foundations, of education which can tap all the hidden talents of every person in any society. It emphasizes that such lifelong learning will be one of the keys to meeting the challenges of the 21st century. What then is education permanente? It is, in fact, a French term for lifelong education. French law specifies that higher education must be open to former students as well as mature students who have not previously had the opportunity of higher education, even if they do not have necessary entrance qualifications, i.e., through a system of lifelong education. It implies that the education system needs to be remade to meet people's lifelong but discontinuous needs, which might recur in personal, social, academic or vocational life. In this sense, lifelong education means the same as recurrent education. Let us look at the concept of recurrent education. 1.3.5 Recurrent education. Recurrent education and its affiliated concepts have been the most debated educational issues. They have been presented as the panacea of all the ills of ailing educational systems and of old ideas. Recurrent education has been called the first new idea in education in this century. Houghton, 1974. Recurrent education, organized in Europe, is understood primarily as the development of a national policy that would provide citizens with opportunities to alternative periods of work with periods of formal training throughout their lives. In general, the learning experiences are to be related to goals. But according to Callan, 1979, p.45, the only new thing about recurrent education is its recurrence. The concept of recurrent education has been launched as an alternative strategy in 1968, first by Olof Palme, at that time Swedish Minister of Education, in his address to the Conference of European Ministers of Education held at Versailles, and later in many Organization of Economic Company Operation and Development, OECD, reports.
There is some argument about the definition of the term recurrent education. Education, which is perhaps summarized by the following rather tautologous suggestions: that recurrent education is the distribution of education over the lifespan of the individual in a recurring way. OECD, 1973, p.7. This means lifelong education is nothing but recurrent education over the lifespan, interspersed with work and or leisure. However, this is a little broader than the earlier definition proposed by OECD that recurrent education is formal and preferably full-time education for adults who want to resume their education, interrupted earlier for a variety of reasons. Jarvis, 1990, p.40. Does it mean second chance formal education to those deprived of education? According to Cullen, 1990, pp.45-6, there are two major risks that have to be avoided in writing on definitions and distinctions in the field. The first relates to the temptation to see distinctions where there are none or where they are irrelevant to educational policy and practice. Much of the literature about the issues ignores the distinctions between recurrent, permanent, and lifelong education and even treats the terms as interchangeable. The second risk that must be avoided is that of reconstructing history. One of the most significant features of recurrent education is that the individual is regarded as having a right to a specified amount of formal education during his lifetime, and that this need not all be completed during the formative years within the period of initial education. It is also regarded as a radical, moral strategy for lifelong education. Unlike continuing education, which appears to occur in piecemeal manner in response to expressed or perceived needs, etc., recurrent educationists regard their approach to be a comprehensive alternative strategy for what are at present three unrelated sectors: a. Conventional post-literacy educational system, b. On-the-job training of all kinds, and c. Adult education. OECD, 1973, p.25 quoted in Jarvis, 1990 p.41. Recurrent education is the organization of lifelong education into periods of systematic study alternating with extended periods of other activity, e.g., work or leisure. Policy instruments of recurrent education fall into two categories: educational and non-educational. The educational strategies are to some extent elaborated. It is stressed that the introduction of recurrent education must be part of a wider policy for educational change in which all types and levels are carefully coordinated. Recurrent education will necessitate reforms in curricula and structure, both at the compulsory and post-compulsory levels. It also implies bringing upper secondary and post-secondary education together into one flexible and integrated system. The non-educational measures include financing policies, educational leave and measures on the labor market and inside industry, as well as impact on transport, housing, medical care and culture. Cullen, 1979, pp.49. 52. According to Jarvis, 1990, p.35-44, recurrent education has two major strands of philosophy: a more radical one that regards it as a strategy for the reform of the whole educational system, and the other, perhaps also a conservative stand, is less ambitious in its claims, preferring rather to regard it as a reformist approach to implementing lifelong education. There is, therefore, a marked difference in the philosophy of the two stands, and yet they both recognize that while education may not be coterminous with initial education, it should be lifelong, a right that all people should receive, and that sufficient provision should be made for them to do so. He raises three major questions. To what extent is continuing education conceptually different from lifelong education? Is continuing education actually synonymous with further education? What is the relationship between continuing and recurrent education? And objectives. Here, we feel it necessary to understand the concepts further education and continuing education, at least to see through the substance in the above questions raised above by Jarvis. 1st March 2006. Further education. Indian Education Commission, 1964-66, observes that education does not end with schooling, but it is a long process. The adult today is in need of an understanding of the rapidly changing world and the growing complexion of society. Even those who have the most sophisticated education must continue to learn, or else the alternative is face obsolescence. In the United Kingdom, further education is a general term used to describe full-time or part-time education for those who have completed their secondary education, higher education, i.e., academic or professional education for students over 18 with university entrance or equivalent qualifications, and adult education. Traditionally, this refers to the 16 to 19 years old young adult, but now it is much broader. Liberal adult education is often a sector of further education, and many colleges of further education have departments of adult education. Additionally, a great deal of continuing education with vocational education is provided by these colleges. But in the Federal Republic of Germany, further education covers adult education, continuing education, and vocational retraining, and is defined as all forms of continuation or resumption of studies after completion of the first educational phase of varying duration and, as a rule, after taking full-time employment. It is for adults of all age groups and educational qualifications, and may be vocational or general. Jarvis 1990A. Further education is, thus, offered primarily for adults of all ages at post-secondary levels. It includes extensive programs designed to keep such professionals as attorneys, physicians, and engineers up to date in their fields. It also includes many varieties of degree programs designed especially for adults, career counseling and counseling for career change services, and programs of non-credit courses. Thus, further education is treated as education for the professionals and for those seeking counseling for careers. Let us now see how further education is different from continuing education. 1st March 2007 Continuing Education. We note that knowledge is not stagnant and constant, it is ever growing, expanding, exploding, and multiplying. All individuals, whether literate or illiterate, student or teacher, employer, employee or unemployed, require endless education throughout life in order to keep abreast of new knowledge for their survival, growth, and development. At the present rate of growth in knowledge, it is calculated that knowledge doubles every 5 years. This necessitates constant learning on the part of an individual to keep himself up to date in his field or the developments in general. Venables, 1976, p. 19, defines continuing education as inclusive of all learning opportunities which can be taken up after full-time, compulsory schooling has ceased. They can be full-time or part-time and will include both vocational and non-vocational study. According to Legge, 1982, p.8, continuing education seems to have reference to some kind of retraining when needed, for example, in a new job. It certainly presupposes that some education has gone before. Presumably initial education, which has first to be completed. According to these definitions, it is clear that continuing education starts after certain level of schooling, while lifelong education is broader as it subsumes continuing education. Continuing education includes those learning opportunities that are taken up after full-time schooling has ended, or those learning opportunities that are taken up after the completion of initial education. It is, in fact, an all-embracing term, and it has assumed currency in the 1980s. Although continuing professional education 7 is also employed in the case of post-basic vocational education 7. The German Education Council define it as the continuation or resumption of organized learning after the completion of an initial educational phase of varying length 7, Jarvis, 1990a. Continuing education is education offered to or undertaken by persons who have completed the cycle of full-time education in childhood. It is a synonym of adult education. It is a term used in the United States to denote the entire range of elementary, secondary and post-secondary educational opportunities offered by public and private agencies, whereby participants of any age engage in academic, vocational, leisure time and personal development activities. DA 1992, p. 13. Mandatory continuing education is the practice by which members of a profession are compelled to attend continuing professional education 7 in order to retain the license to practice. Usually the profession stipulates the extent of their obligation, e.g., at least one refresher course 7 every 5 years. In America, a large number of professions are introducing mandatory continuing education, and in some states it is required to register to practice in that state. Open continuing education is the term used in the Federal Republic of Germany to mean the continuation or resumption of organized learning after the completion of any kind of primary or secondary education. This definition is very close to that of continuing education in the United Kingdom, although in practice in Germany this term appears to be closer to initial adult education. In India and in the United Kingdom, departments or centers of adult and continuing education exist in different universities. What then does the term adult and continuing education 7 denote? Is it different from adult education and continuing education? In fact, it is a fusion of the two terms, adult education 7 and continuing education. It is an attempt to end the historic division between adult liberal education 7 and vocational education in the United Kingdom, and to illustrate that both are about the education of adults. Conceptually this is valid, but it was seen by some as a sign that liberal adult education had little future. Jarvis, 1990a. Is there any difference between lifelong education, further education and continuing education? According to Jarvis, 1990, pp. 36-7, lifelong education makes no distinction between initial and post-initial education, whereas continuing education refers only to the later part of lifelong education and is only one branch of education. Continuing education, however, is not the same as further education for a number of reasons. Further education is post-compulsory but not necessarily post-initial. Further education tends to imply a specific level of study, whereas continuing education does not. Further education is usually pre-vocational, vocational or academic, while conceptually continuing education need 20 to not be directed towards any course assessment or award. While technological advancements have come to the aid of policymakers and promoters of education for all, the adults with ability to study on their own or independently are the most benefited ones. There are now different modes of education that have interface with technology. Let us discuss a few such current concepts of adult education. which are the results of technological interface. 1st March 2008 Correspondence education. Correspondence education can be said to be one of the earliest and institutionalized means of providing distance education. Learning materials prepared by a few trained subject experts are supplied to the learners by post for reading, alongside giving them some reading and writing assignments to develop in them the feel of formal school classroom atmosphere. Contact classes programs are conducted at some convenient places where the learners and the instructors come together for face-to-face personal interaction. At the end of the course, examinations are conducted and certificates, degrees, or diplomas are awarded to successful candidates. Correspondence education, a form of education organized through the written education medium, began in Britain as early as 1840. Pitman started teaching shorthand through correspondence in England towards the end of the 19th century. In America there were attempts to introduce it in 1873, but it really began with Chautauqua in 1879, Jarvis, 1990a. Correspondence education consists of batches of study materials sent by post to the student, who then completes the required reading and exercises, and returns the latter to the college for assessment by an appointed personal tutor. The exercises are marked and the student receives comments, advice and general guidance. Legge, 1982, p.86. From the above definition, the following essential elements can be observed. 1. Supply of study materials along with writing exercises assignments by post to students. 2. Returning of written exercises assignments by the students. 3. Assessment of and feedback on exercises assignments by the tutor. We can thus find in this definition that there is an organized educational instruction and interaction made possible through printed and or written material sent by post. Correspondence education is education conducted through postal services with or without face-to-face contact between teacher and learners. Teaching is done by written or tape-recorded material sent to the learner, whose progress is monitored through written or taped exercises sent to the teacher, who corrects them and returns them to the learner with criticism and advice. It is also called correspondence study, Tatmus, 1989. This definition is slightly more advanced, in the sense that it brings in electronic media within the purview of correspondence education. From the above definitions, it is very clear that correspondence education is a means of education for those who are literates and with certain level of basic skills of self-reading and writing, as well as with some kind of mastery over the written language, and also with some educational qualifications already possessed by them. Usually these learners are relatively more mature and are in a position to learn on their own through self-study or self-understanding of the printed materials and or the electronic materials supplied to them. It is, thus, education mainly for adults or others who are literate with ability for self-study. To be brief and precise, it is an education offered for literates with certain educational qualifications through correspondence mode of teaching and learning. There may or may not be provision for face-to-face contact between the teacher and the learner. 1st March 2009 Distance education. In simple terms, the system of education in which education is imparted from a place to a distant learner is called distance education. The institutionalized Education offered by or received from the correspondence distance education institutions and open universities falls under distance education. Now, let us look at some of the definitions of distance education for clarity and better understanding about it, and also of the subtle differences, if any, between correspondence education and distance education. Different definitions of distance education have been offered by different distance educationists. Distance education has been variously described as correspondence education, open education, open learning, etc. According to Dohman, 1967, p.9. Quoted in Keegan, 1986, p.39, distance education is a systematically organized form of self-study in which student counseling, presentation of learning materials, and securing and supervision of students' success is carried out by a team of teachers, each of whom has specific responsibilities. Morey, 1972, quoted in Wright, 1990, p.156, defines distance teaching as the /tilili of instructional methods in which the teaching behaviors are executed. AP, LN-IOII the learning behaviors, including those which in a contiguous situative W-T, LH, IB2 CRL owned in the learner's presence, so that communication between the teacher and the learner must be facilitated by print, electronic, mechanical or audio /ISIS. According to him, transactional distance is a function of two variables called dialogue, which describes the extent to which the learner and educator are able to respond to each other, and structure L, which measures an educational program's responsiveness to Leimer's individual needs. Combining dialogue and structure, he developed 4 types of distance teaching programs. I. Programs with no dialogue and no structure, DS. 2. Programs with no dialogue but with structure, D+S. 3. Programs with dialogue and /structure, plus D+S, and 4. Programs with dialogue and no structure, plus DS. Plus D and plus S represent dialogue and structure respectively, and D and S represent no dialogue and no structure. But, according to Bodh, et al. 1, 1980, distance between the teacher and learner is not merely geographical and educational but psychological as well. It is a transactional distance in the relationship of the two partners in the educational enterprise. Bora, 1990, pp. 7-8, opines that distance is not to be seen as a poor relation or distant cousin of the formal system. It is a system of non-formal education in its own right. It has its own philosophy, its own goals, and its own methodology. If the formal system has served the society fruitfully, so does the system of distance education hope to do so. It does not compete with the formal system, but supplements it. It caters to those sections of society which, either being located in far-flung remote areas or because of economic compulsions, cannot take advantage of the formal system. It also provides another opportunity to those members of the community who have had to discontinue their education at one point or the other because of any reason whatsoever. It provides the support, services, guidance and counseling, and libraries through study centers. This definition is, perhaps, more general in nature, and its approach is based on philosophical point of view. According to Peters, D 973 p.206 quoted in Keegan, 1986, p.41, Distance Teaching 1. Education is a method of imparting knowledge, skills and attitudes which is rationalized by the application of division of labor and organizational principles, as well as by the extensive use of technological media, especially for the purpose of reproducing high-quality teaching materials, which makes it possible to instruct great numbers of students at the same time wherever they live. It is an industrialized form of teaching and learning. In this context, you can compare this definition with IGNOU as an educational industry so that you can better understand and appreciate this definition. You can engage your fellow student as well in this discussion whenever you find a chance to meet them. Adus, 1975, defines distance education as a method of teaching in which the teacher bears the responsibility of imparting knowledge and skills to a student who does not receive instructions orally, but who studies in a place and at a distance determined by his individual circumstances. According to Homburg, 1977, distance education include various forms of study at all levels which are not under the continuous, immediate supervision of tutors present with their students in lecture rooms or on the premises. Nevertheless, the distance education method benefits from the planning, guidance and tuition of a tutorial organization. Distance education is a means of providing learning experiences for students through the use of self-instructional materials and access to educational resources, the use of which is largely determined by the student and which allow the student, for the most part, to choose the time, place and circumstances of learning. Gao, 1981, p.10. Keegan, 1986, p.49, describes distance education as a form of education characterized by